Well, hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest this week is my friend and prominent civic activist here in LA, Sarah Dusseault. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to finally get you here. When I originally thought of doing this podcast, your name was on my kind of original list. So here we are. I think this will be my 60th episode, and we're finally
Wow,
sitting down. So I'm
that's
excited.
exciting.
Yeah, it's been
I'm
really.
happy to be here.
Yeah, I was thinking about this interview and where I should start it or how I could start it, and it was really hard for me to come up with it because you sort of have a current career and a career path that is very difficult to kind of put in a box. You've done so many different things, most of which have been positive for the community. You've kind of dedicated your life in that direction, which is really cool. But I thought maybe we could kind of get around to all of that by just kind of starting with what you're up to today.
Absolutely. Well, I love problem solving, and I love being a part of the community and jumping in and trying to solve problems where I'm needed. And one of the challenges that I think is really holding us back is the high cost of capital. And when interest rates changed a few years ago, I don't know that we understood how long and sustained this change was going to be. I think a lot of people sort of bet on it. Oh, it'll bump up for a while, it'll bump down, and not realizing how difficult it would be to get to come out of the pandemic and really for markets to normalize and for us to be able to access the money we need to build and buy the buildings we need to get people housed. So the effect that this has had on housing has been significant in terms of us being able to build the units we need to build to address our housing crisis. I mean, some people say that statewide we need to build 2 million units. Some studies say that in LA County we need to build 400,000 units. Whatever figure you want to point to, we need to be building faster. And that issue is really a challenge for the city and county of Los Angeles. So Mayor Bass has been very aware of this challenge. And after working with her on Executive Directive 1, which was a way to accelerate the timeline for permits for 100% affordable housing, we looked at, well, how are we actually getting that housing funded? How are we actually getting access to capital to get projects built? And the idea of LA for LA is how are we tapping into the tools of philanthropy, the tools of private capital, and the tools of government in order to come up with new pathways that are different from the typical pathway of tax credit financing that can take 3 to 5 years. And what are we doing in order to drive down the cost of capital, but also making it more, democratic, small d, that there's access to capital for nonprofits, for for-profits, for all sorts of folks who are trying to make the community better.
Totally. And so this is LA for LA. It's it's only a few months old at this point,
It's
right?
only a few months old. We've raised around $20 million. We're hoping to raise a lot more, but we're both a fund and a connector. So at the same time that we're raising money, we're engaging in projects and diving into the community and trying to see what are the challenges we can solve? What are the new models we can help support? So we recently opened a building with a partner, Prophet Walker, and he runs Treehouse Communities. And he had a stalled transit-oriented community development project. So he had a stalled TOC project where he had an 11% set aside for affordable, and it was completely stalled because of access to capital. So in the midst of COVID, the cost of construction went up, 20, 30% because of supply chain issues and other issues. And so he was simply going to have to turn around and sell the building, not quite done. And instead, we were able to jump in, offer a small sliver of what's called a PRI, or program-related income loan, from a foundation. And then in addition to that, we were able to put some grant money into the project. So we completed the project. He's converting it to 100% affordable through a master lease with the LASA master lease program. And that is also enabling him to have access to project-based vouchers, because the population we're serving is a population the federal government and Mayor Bass are trying to serve, which is people coming out of encampments. And so there's some special funding that was set aside in President Biden's All Inside program, and we're tapping into that as well. So at the end of the day, we're going to get a senior loan in place for a really reasonable rate. And he's going to have equity in place, at a reasonable rate. And he's going to have this, knowing that people are paying their rent through this federal program, and not have, it's perfectly predictable and very little risk. And that really changes, how banks approach financing. So the financial well-being of the building has been secured, as well as making it available to people who need it the most, people coming out of encampments.
Totally. The 20 million that you raised, where did it come from? Like, what's the breakdown?
So it comes from, we started with seed funding from the Hilton Foundation, Conrad and Hilton Foundation, and I was just really impressed with their willingness to take a risk on us. We're just a startup trying to problem solve in a space. So I think that was a big leap for them, and we're grateful to them for that. So we started with funding from them. We have funding from our partner, California Community Foundation, who are both our fiscal sponsor as well as our partner in the fund generally. And then we also have funding from individuals who have donor-advised funds. So there are thousands of families, to be honest, in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County who have donor-advised funds as part of their giving portfolio. And they use these funds in order to support the organizations they love or provide potentially low-interest loans. So we are trying to tap into that resource and let people know, folks who have donor-advised funds, here's a way to really give back to your community and potentially make a very significant impact. And you can also recycle those funds. So the donor-advised fund that's putting into the Eves project that I was just talking about, that money will be returned to the donor-advised fund within a year. And they can turn around and recycle that into the next project and the next project. So I think a lot of people struggle with, well, what can I do about the housing crisis? What can I do about homelessness? And I think the mayor and our group, LA for LA, is offering an avenue for people to get involved and actually see in real time. I mean, in that particular case, we were able to start housing people within 4 months. So from the date that we started to do our due diligence on the project to the date that a person moved in was 4 months, which is pretty incredible. And that's the type of speed and scale that we're looking to model. And then we hope other people copy us. We're not trying to sort of corner the market. We're trying to present these as prototypes and hope that other entities say, "Oh, that makes sense. I'm gonna do something different with, how I'm investing in Los Angeles."
For sure. One of the things in all the years that we've been working on this issue together, one of the things that's always bothered me, and I've actually asked several guests who've come on podcasts about this, so I'm curious to get your take, is just why in this town, in the wealth that we have, in the corporate wealth and individual wealth, why we haven't seen something like we've seen in the Bay Area or Seattle, where corporations come in and, whatever you say about it, they're pledging billions of dollars to do similar things. It's not exactly what LA for LA is doing, but it's similar. Why do you think LA has struggled to attract that kind of capital?
Well, I think, and we are trying to tap into that and change that narrative with our work. But I think LA has struggled because there's something beautiful about Los Angeles where, it doesn't matter where you came from. It doesn't matter what your last name is. This is a town where dreams come true. And I think that is beautiful, but it also tends to not necessarily create a civic identity that belongs to Los Angeles. So I think a lot of people come here from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I've seen it time again where they will, if they make it really big, they will turn around and continue to give to where they came from. Now, they've been here 20 years. They've been here 30 years. They've made billions here. But they may be thinking, well, no, I really want to give back to the town I came from, which is not Los Angeles. And so I think something that the mayor is doing and, other civic leaders are stepping into is building that civic identity to I think reinforce the fact that, look, LA has been good to a lot of us. We really need to give back to Los Angeles. And there are quite a few people that are doing that. I mean, there are several leaders in this space that are really changing that narrative. And I do think we need to continue to lift them up. I mean, obviously, the Broad family is sort of a significant one in that area. But there are many others that are really trying to change that narrative and create a space where people really give back to the civic culture of LA.
Yeah. So interesting. I had a prominent Hollywood producer on the show at one point, and we weren't really talking about this, but I wanted to get his take on why the media companies haven't stepped up.
Yeah.
And he offered a really interesting perspective, which kind of ties to with what you just said. He was basically arguing that, if you're the CEO of Disney, you don't automatically identify with LA because you're selling a multinational product.
Right.
Your revenues, even though this is the home of Hollywood and everyone associates this town with Hollywood, Hollywood's making money everywhere. And so they don't have the same tie as an Amazon would to their jurisdiction. I mean, even though Amazon's making money, they have all these employees there, where Hollywood is kind of this distributed network. That was his theory, which I think is kind of interesting, but it's still... It wasn't quite compelling enough for me. I thought it was an interesting perspective, but I feel like even, like an Iger and them, I feel like they should step up. Disney should be stepping up and putting in significant resources into this town. But what's your take?
I think that the corporations having sort of feeling like they're international corporations is very real. But I also just think there is a culture, if you were born in New York, you're a New Yorker. You don't lose that moniker of being a New Yorker. Being an Angeleno means something different to almost everyone. And that pluralism of Los Angeles is a beautiful thing. But it also means that I don't think we have that same hometown, home team feel that, if you're from Boston, you're always from Boston. My husband's from Boston. He's always from Boston. He's always going to root for the Red Sox. He's always you're just raised that way.
Yeah.
And I think that there is something about Los Angeles and the pluralism that we enjoy that I think has both its benefits, but also means it's hard for folks to identify as an Angeleno. And so the different projects I'm working on are trying to lift that up. I mean, one of them is called the Angeleno Project for a reason, and you're a part of it. We're trying to lift up, what does it mean to be an Angeleno and to be a part of this city and really help identify that so that people can be like, oh yeah, that's what it means to be here. And this is how I can give back. And this is what, I want to see in a future Los Angeles. Because I think absolutely there's work to be done about, that kind of civic pride. We have a huge opportunity coming with hosting the Olympics. So, there is a lot of opportunity when you have, some big event, international, obviously, event, but that really helps create that civic pride. So I think we have a lot of opportunities coming up for that. But I think, a lot of civic leaders, yourself included, we're thinking about this. And the fact that we're thinking about it means that, we have an opportunity for change.
Yeah, I think so. I remain optimistic. I think there's still like a huge hurdle, which is, I don't really know how to describe it that well, but I think it comes down to sort of an apathy among business professionals, let's say, or as people who aren't inclined to be interested in local politics, where, many of our friends, for example, don't really even have any idea what's going on. Like they may have voted in the mayor's race, but they don't know a single person on city council. They don't know any of the county supervisors, couldn't pick them out of a lineup. And I feel like maybe that the trend is reversing, where the apathy is dissipating instead of getting worse. But that the Olympics is a great opportunity to wake people up to that.
For sure. I mean, there are other, I think solving homelessness is a great opportunity too.
Yeah.
I think that the apathy is rampant everywhere right now. Post-pandemic, I think apathy is a real thing and a real challenge. It was present before, but it only was exacerbated.
Yeah.
Because of the isolation and loneliness that, we all experienced and a lot of people are still experiencing.
Yeah.
So I think that's very real. On a sort of lighter note, I have a group of friends, we have game nights and we like to play the game Celebrities. I don't know if you've ever played it.
I've never played that, yeah.
So Celebrities is you write, each person writes like 5 to 10 names on a little slip of paper and you put the names in a bowl. And it's usually like a celebrity is defined as, it's reasonable that the people in the room should know this name. So I always throw in a local politician's name. And it usually leads to much hilarity where I'll be like, that's your congressman.
Right. Yeah. It's like, that's amazing. But yes,
But it's fun because, they'll put in some obscure, film noir star that I don't know.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of a fun way to kind of lift that up. But I actually think what's interesting right now is, and what I certainly tell my friends is how much good you can do in local politics. I mean, the reason I'm engaged in local politics, I mean, one of many reasons is that the return is quick. Like you can make a difference and see that difference within a matter of months on a project that you're working on locally and in Los Angeles. And, sometimes at the federal level or the state level, you're looking for policy changes or systems change that's going to take, years and years. And locally, there's so much that people can do with such a quick turnaround that has an immediate effect potentially for the better for people's lives. So
yeah, that's true.
I think you've seen that. I mean, in your work and that, that's pretty gratifying to see like in the course of a year or two, big changes that really make a difference. So I try to entice people into local conversations with that. If you want to see change, this is the place to get involved.
Yeah, it presents in a different way than Congress does, for example, or like, let's say you wanted to try to overturn some Supreme Court ruling or something. It seems so remote where there are some issues, not every issue, because some of these issues like homelessness, which we'll talk about later, like requires every layer of government essentially to do something if you want to solve it. But some things you can make a difference on right away. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that might be the opportunity. People talk about, this is the vote, the election to save democracy. But ever having worked in this local politics field for maybe a decade now, I kind of feel like that's the answer, is actually if people go, instead of looking at these big things, they start really small and say, okay, what's going on in my community that I want to make a difference on? And then that's a more effective entree or entry point into politics than just like looking up Politico and saying like, how do I feel about gun control? Or, it's hard to even engage in national politics, but local politics, you can say, okay, there's a safety problem in my neighborhood. Let me go work on that. And you can make a difference.
Yeah, I think, and I don't want to discourage people from, shifting national policy because it's so important. But there are real tangible policy changes that we've worked on locally that have really changed things for the better. And we also see in Los Angeles that other cities, copy us. There are a lot of policies that we've worked on over the years that, you can see folks turning around and doing in other cities. And that's pretty exciting too. So we do have a national impact here for sure.
Totally. Yeah, this is, in my view, it's the most important culturally city in America. Like New York, maybe arguably is on the same level, but people look to Los Angeles for many things, and it's a driver of our narrative about what it means to be an American.
It absolutely is,
Yeah.
and it's such an exciting place. I mean, all the almost 200 languages spoken here, the neighborhoods that have very unique identities, and that treasure those identities. I mean, that's very unique, and hard to replicate. And the celebration, I think, of diversity and pluralism is really fascinating and wonderful. So I think there's challenges left and right, and there's the fact of the matter is we have a very racist past. We have a lot to grapple with. How freeways were built, the redlining that went on, all of those things contribute to our lack of housing now and the lack of access to housing. And they have a disproportionate effect on particularly on Black people, but on all sorts of communities. And that is, that's something we have to grapple with. But at the same time, I think there's so much that's positive going on right now in terms of the work to address that and the work to um, really create neighborhoods that are access for everyone.
For sure. I want to get into some of these big issues with you in a minute, but before we do that, I want to hear the story of how you ended up in this local politics, civic
And
activism world in the first place. Like, how did it start for you?
so I went to UCLA Law School, and after law school, I clerked on the Ninth Circuit for Judge Kim Wardlaw. And she had come out of, once you're a judge, you cannot participate in politics. But she had been very active, both locally and nationally, in politics in her prior life. And and her husband, Bill Wardlaw, was still active, and he was about to work on he was co-chairing a campaign for a guy named Jim Hahn, who was running for mayor. And Bill said, "Oh, you don't want to go to a law firm and make money. You should come and work on a campaign." Um, and I was like, "Oh, that does sound good." And so I started on Jim Hahn's campaign as policy director. Um, this was a while ago, so we had Thomas guides. We had these huge Thomas guide maps, and I learned the city through that campaign, and I fell madly in love with the city. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had an opportunity to talk to Jim Hahn. He's now a judge, so he's not engaged in political life. So I'm not sure if he'd come on the podcast, but Judge Hahn is, his family is one of those families that is part of the fabric of Los Angeles. His father was on the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors for 40 years. And he grew up, as part of LA. They had a bag of asphalt in the back of their wagon and would stop and shovel it into potholes on a regular basis. I mean, he grew up in South LA and was just, part of the fabric of Los Angeles. And so that was really fascinating to learn the city that way. And there were two campaign consultants working on that at the time, a guy named Bill Carrick and a guy named Cam Kawada. And Cam has since passed away. But they were really, it was just one of those things where you stumble in and you were welcomed in, and it was really amazing to learn that much about the city that fast. And it was just a great experience. And so from that, Jim only served one term as mayor. He made some really politically challenging decisions, which was that he fought at that time the secession movement because the Valley wanted to secede or divorce from the city of Los Angeles, which would have really changed Los Angeles substantially and probably not for the better. And then he also had this challenging sort of confrontation with his police chief and did not renew the police chief's term. So between those two things, it was difficult for him to seek reelect, but he felt and he had made the right decision. And I that was also something, to be around was really to learn, a steep learning curve about politics and local politics. So that was fascinating. And then from there, I worked with Eric Garcetti. I've worked with David Rue. I've worked with a variety of people who've served in different offices. And then I've also worked very closely with the Board of Supervisors because of my passion around mental health and homelessness. So at the same time that I was deputy mayor for housing and homelessness under Mayor Hahn, my brother was starting to experience the significant side effects of schizophrenia. He was in his early 20s at the time, and there just wasn't any real help available. We're getting better at this, but at that time, there genuinely was nothing. And the operations at the time, they would just respond by arresting people. And so slowly over time, the sort of our single largest mental health institution, if you can call it that, became our local jails because an overwhelming majority of folks were suffering from mental illness and were just being jailed.
What year was this when this started?
For my brother, it started around 2000.
Okay.
And so having this personal experience, how it played into policy, is I remember going in to see Mayor Hahn, and I said, "You let 5:00. Let's just go look out the window at City Hall at 5:00." So at that time, they were releasing people who basically had been arrested for some sort of issue that had an issue with mental health. And they would release groups of people at the same time, and they would just be walking up the street, and you knew they were just coming out of jail, and they had no money, nowhere to go, no access to resources, and you could tell weren't doing well, and folks were not doing well. And I knew about this because my brother would be among them. So he'd be arrested for, indecent exposure, or he'd be arrested for, public intoxication or whatever it was. But it was really relating to his schizophrenia and him having, a psychotic break. And he would then be released. And that's how I would find him. So I became an expert at sort of how the system worked, not just in terms of trying to find help for him, but also in terms of realizing where I could find him. People would always ask, well, how would you, once he'd go missing, how would you find him? And Well, I would, because I would look up on the inmate locator. There's just a general system, and you can look up a name, and I would find his name, and I know if he was in jail or not, and then I'd know generally about when he would be released. And then I would just suddenly appear. Um, so, and being able to share that with the then mayor and other supervisors and show them sort of how it was working really made an impact, because then folks were starting to recognize, well, this is really broken. And there are just some real heroes in local government who have taken this on and are trying, to figure out how to implement real systems change. Supervisor Catherine Barger, Supervisor Hilda Solis, have been at the forefront of, getting into the weeds and seeing how this is affecting real people, and particularly young people, because a lot of times schizophrenia, particularly for males, hits right around your upper teens, early 20s. And parents then become beside themselves because it's really difficult to find help. So together, we've been able to implement a ton of reform in terms of early intervention and better access to mental health care. I mean, there's a lot more to do, but it's very different than it was 20 years ago, where literally you could set your watch by when a group of people who were suffering from mental illness would be released from the jails every single day.
Yeah. So back in 2000, that was like the standard protocol, was just incarceration.
Yeah.
Was that true of just anyone on the street who was publicly intoxicated, not just mental health cases? Was that how they were dealing with homelessness back in 2000?
It was how they were dealing with homelessness, but there were not that many people experiencing homelessness. So homelessness has really increased over the last 20 years because of many reasons. Obviously, the high cost of housing, a lack of building enough housing, and a variety of other reasons. And so at that time, I want to say there were I'm not positive, but I think there were 14,000 people experiencing homelessness. And I have to double check and make sure I'm using the right number. So if you think about that in terms of, close to 80,000 now, the difference, they were really only arresting people who were kind of visibly acting out, which tended to be people experiencing mental illness.
Yeah.
So in terms of the one for one, were the arrests really focused on folks who were experiencing mental illness? I think it was pretty significant. And you saw that in the jail system. If you talk to a custodial deputy, they would tell you what was going on. They'd say, "Oh wow, things have changed. Like this is really different." So that's something that I've tried to keep with me in terms of all of my policy work, is experience of people who are on the ground, who are really in real time experiencing the system, because they tend to have, whether it's lived expertise or it's, frontline workers, they tend to have a lot of data and information before anyone else.
Yeah. And the schizophrenia stuff, I had a little experience with it, where I had a friend who developed it relatively late. He was like late 20s. So, which is unusual because it's usually. But his younger brother had developed it. So they had 3 kids.
Oh, wow.
Both of them, the middle one did not develop schizophrenia. But the parents ended up taking him in. But he got caught up in, this was in the state of New York, where, he had a violent episode at home, and then was basically forcibly admitted and then given these drugs, and then developed enough wherewithal to know what was happening, and ended up committing suicide shortly thereafter.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. It was really hard to deal with. This is about a decade ago, but after talking to people who are familiar with that system, that is a very common outcome of
Yes.
the
Yeah.
forced medication of somebody.
Yeah.
His parents had resisted that, but they couldn't manage. They're not mental health professionals.
Right.
They got two schizophrenic kids in their house, and so in this particular episode, they just couldn't take it anymore. They took him in, and then it was just a big,
Yeah.
terrible tragedy. But
One of the great honors that I've had is going to Trieste, Italy, with Carrie Morrison and seeing their mental health system firsthand, and then the work that Heart Forward has been doing locally to try and replicate that system. The 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 biggest thing that I see is that they have access to care earlier on. And it's really all about, I mean, she talks about it in terms of radical hospitality, but there's also, which the concept is simply welcoming people at whatever stage they're in. But I think there also is just this idea of a lack of escalation. And here, the way our systems were set up, there is this escalation, confrontation. If law enforcement is sort of your first call, then you're leading to confrontation and escalation, and that does lead to hopelessness in people. I mean, it really does, both in families and people experiencing it, and that hopelessness is tragic. I mean, part of the issues we're facing with so many people experiencing homelessness, we have about 2,000 people dying every single year on our streets. And that's an unacceptable number of people dying. And they're dying for all sorts of reasons. And it's a product of this hopelessness of, if we don't implement real systems change and access to real care. And I do think generally in the community and civic leadership, it's hard for people to feel positive, to be able to say, oh, wait, that person experiencing a psychotic break could actually have a productive life. But I've seen it with my brother firsthand. I mean, he is right now living in a boarding care. He has friends. He's sober. He's it's a struggle. It's a real struggle, but he's doing fantastic. And I think that I think we as Americans generally haven't gotten our heads around the issue of mental health the same way that other countries have.
yeah, whatever we're doing is not working. I mean, my understanding of how we got to this point was that in the old days, it was really kind of a shady system. So, like pre 1967, there was an act, I forget the name of it, Lanterman Pettus or something is the name of it. But in the old days, there was the mental health, institutes that were state funded, state run, or maybe federally funded. I'm not even sure, but they were being abused and used by, a lot of times men who that wanted to like get even with their wives, and people were getting locked up. Basically, people were getting locked up in these institutions in a very unfair way. So the policy shifted dramatically in the other direction, where became very difficult for the state to intervene in the private life of someone, even if they did have a severe mental health. And now we're kind of coming back to the middle. Newsom has this, I forget what he calls it, these care
Yeah.
courts, which they seem to be working. But what's your take? Do you think like we're finding that middle ground where like the state can effectively intervene, or is there still more work to do?
Well, I think there's a lot more work to do, and it's around access to care. I mean, there are just some amazing people who do this work, mental health professionals, um, who are on the front lines, who are just incredible. And, they need to feel empowered. There needs to be enough of them. Um, and so I think Care Court is a good idea, but it's only going to work if there are services to support it. And if there are mental health workers to support that work, and if there's housing to support that work. So for me, it's really about the whole system and the work we've done around, Heart Forward is creating an ecosystem that's effective. It's really about a whole system that is effective in terms of providing that ongoing support. I mean, we do it in other areas. I mean, if somebody lost their leg or if somebody had a heart attack, we sort of understand what kind of care is needed and we provide it and we give them, a wheelchair or a prosthetic. With mental health, we sort of think, oh, we can, make somebody take a pill and we're done. And that's not what that illness is. And the isolation that the whole community is already suffering from because of the pandemic, and many people would argue even before the pandemic, how our city has become more fragmented, more polarized. That is more challenging for people struggling with mental health issues than for anyone. And so I just think we need a different, culturally, just need a different approach. We need to just think about mental health as just the same as you would check up, a heart condition, the same as you would check up, anything, and create those sustained community supports. So one thing I'm working on with Heart Forward is, and this nonprofit out of New York City, it's called Fountain House. It's called a clubhouse. I don't love the name because the name doesn't explain anything, but it's a peer-driven resource where folks can come during the day and really engage in and be a part of community. And it's for folks struggling, with mental health issues. And we don't have enough of that. There's not enough community building around supporting mental health issues. I think we're making progress, but that's fundamentally, one of the challenges. And families who are struggling with children or loved ones, they become isolated. They feel, ashamed or they're struggling, and there isn't, the supports that they need in place. I mean, if you have a missing loved one, it's really hard. Like it's hard to figure out how to find them.
Yeah.
And there really isn't anything worse. Can you imagine if one of your children were missing and you knew they were somewhere in Los Angeles and probably not safe, and struggling with severe mental illness? I mean, that happens to families on a daily basis. And so we have to think about holistic systems change where we have an ecosystem where anyone can get access to care, and care is seen as something that's supportive and good and not, stigmatized.
Yeah. I agree. I feel like we've sort of missed the mark collectively in dealing with this crisis. And I think people have been scared away by the apparent size of the financial commitments necessary to do this right. But my argument back to those folks is like, you're paying for it one way or the other.
Oh, yeah.
It's like people
Yeah.
are gonna, if someone has a mental health issue and they don't have financial support, they don't have family to take care of them, they're going to become your problem and everyone else's problem very quickly. They're gonna be on the streets and
Yeah.
impacting business and whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. No, our system is very expensive with bad outcomes. So
Yeah.
we could save a ton of money and focus on good outcomes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the things I'm working on is reforming kind of how the system overall is looked at through governance reform. So the executive table, and then I'm serving on the leadership table, which is, these are basically just two the leadership table is an advisory body, the executive table is a governing body, but two bodies covering the county of Los Angeles, looking at all of these issues as they relate to people experiencing homelessness. And being able to lift up, we could have a much more effective, more efficient system. I think in the long run is actually going to cost a lot less. a fantastic mental health worker is a lot less expensive than an overnight stay in an emergency room.
Yeah.
And we just have to figure out how we're supporting, a system that's more effective.
Yeah. And I feel like in this town, there is a willingness to support these policies, which is cool. Like there is a generosity among Angelenos, even Angelenos who are apathetic, like we talk about. They have been voting for policies that seem to make sense to them, and I feel like that sentiment is still there. And now it's time to take it to the final step, which is to address these missing pieces. Which, in my view, it sounds like it's same as yours. It's like access to the proper care, whether it's we've been talking about mental health, but I think the same is true on the drug front. It's like, well, we're not going to win the war on drugs, right? So we've already spent, I don't know how many billions we spent on that, but we're not going to win that. So what are we going to do with someone who does have a drug problem in our city? Are we just going to let them die on the streets, or are we going to have a more intelligent strategy? And just like with mental health, that requires an investment, and people can get off drugs. We actually know how to do that. And we just need to figure out how to do that at a bigger scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sort of innovative work around substance use that some groups are really tapping into. There's some really amazing people out of the Department of Health Services working in Skid Row. There's fantastic folks working around harm reduction and working around really meeting people where they are, and then and lifting them up. And we're some of that work is happening, but the reality is that I don't think again, in this sort of ecosystem idea, if we think back to Trieste, where we were, I mean, we went to a sort of basic strip mall, sort of 2-story little, like parking lot, little,
Yeah.
I think there was like a gelato place, there was like a dry cleaner, and there was a clinic. And you walk in, and if you're not doing well, there were beds on the second story. So you could immediately, and you were met by 2 nurses who were dressed like I'm dressed now. They were both wearing jeans.
Yep.
They were completely, and they just met you where you are and said, oh, when you were off to get your dry cleaning, you could also stop off at the clinic and check in. And the other thing that they were doing is you walk in and it smells amazing because they're making a community lunch. So folks within the community who are struggling could sign up and say, oh, I'm coming to lunch, on Tuesdays. And their peers are making them lunch, and they were serving this community lunch. And you could check in on each other, at this community lunch. The facility, as I said, it's in the strip mall. It was directly next door to a little primary care, child care. I think in Los Angeles, that'd be very difficult if we were going to open, I think their understanding of mental health care as a necessity, access to, substance use support as a necessity is very different than how, we approach it, where it's always, it's sort of pushed to the side and difficult to find and sort of shameful and only accessible in certain neighborhoods. And their idea that every neighborhood needed these kinds of supports really meant that if you walk around that city, there's almost no one experiencing homelessness, and there's no one experiencing severe mental illness out on the streets. People, they have the same percentage in any community. If you have 100 people in Italy, 100 people in Los Angeles, you're going to have some percentage. Some people say 5%, some people say 5 to 10%. You're going to have some percentage of people who are going to struggle with mental illness, and we need to just plan for that and make sure the supports are in place.
Yeah, I totally agree. Were they doing harm reduction in Trieste?
They were. They were. Harm reduction with the sort of ultimate goal of getting people to then engage in, in reduction of use and sobriety. But they absolutely have had harm reduction resources.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because one of the things that's to me odd about the approach that's happening in this town right now is that we are sort of like we're going down one path of harm reduction, which I understand the sort of psychological philosophy behind it, which is you got to get somebody kind of in a stable place for them to make a decision to become sober. You can't just force them to. But we're not doing the second step. We're just like, you can go to the library in West Hollywood and get Narcan, but there's nobody there to like welcome you in and get you into a stable environment to then try to go to the next phase, which is like, okay, how do we help this person break this habit?
Yeah, I mean, we have a really vibrant AA community in Los Angeles, and they are there. I mean, they're not maybe as noticeable, but we have a very very vibrant sober community in Los Angeles. And I've gotten to know them a little bit through my brother, because with his schizophrenia he would self medicate with any available drug, whatever
Mm-hmm.
it was. Um, so I think we're not maybe tapping into them as much as we could, but there's a pretty vibrant community. It's just if you're not in that community, you're maybe not seeing it. But there's a really cool community out there that's really supportive. I think the challenge is that, again, because we don't have early intervention on severe mental illness in the way that we should. Excuse me, we're starting to it, but then if you have schizophrenia and you're self-medicating with meth, it's pretty difficult to like that's a really difficult
It's going to get
combination.
way worse very fast.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very difficult combination. So
Yeah.
it's not I think you'd be surprised how vibrant that community is, um and how supportive they are. And it's just we just need a little bit more of everything, and we just need um, a lot of focus on early interventions that I think change outcomes. I
Yeah.
mean, that's the bottom line. Is if our system now is really expensive, bad outcomes. It's like, again, the goal of the leadership table and what we're focused on is how do we sort of set these big goals, and big outcome driven goals, and then what are all the pieces that then need to be put in place to reach those goals, so that we stop thinking about it in terms of just like we have a mentality of scarcity, and so we're like, oh, okay, we can help a little bit with this one thing, or a little bit with this other thing, and we don't think about it holistically, and that's where we're going to get the huge efficiencies if we're thinking about the system as a whole.
Yeah. One of the things that absolutely shocked me about the last mayoral election is that we had two candidates who were running on sort of opposed views on how to handle the homelessness crisis, for example. But what really shocked me that the press didn't cover, Angelenos didn't pick up on, is that neither one of them was offering a solution that actually addressed the scale. So like, and I think it's a function of the lack of resources. Like maybe there's good reasons for that, but Caruso supposedly was going to do 30,000 shelter beds or something like that, if I remember right. And then Mayor Bass was focused more on sort of transitional housing to permanent housing. But neither one of them was saying, hey, there's 80,000 people or whatever, 40,000 if you look in LA, and here's how much money it's going to cost and whatnot. And Angelenos just let it pass. They didn't. No one really stepped up to criticize the campaigns. And I feel like the answer you just gave about like, hey, we need to like actually have a holistic plan to solve it is the truth. And my question is, what in your view, like if you could just change the whole thing right now without any resource constraints, how would you change it to solve these myriad of issues? Because it's mental health, it's homelessness, it's substance abuse, and it's housing. So if you could like just make it up, what would it be?
Well, I think, to answer your question, I do think it's, and this is the hope of the leadership table. I've always like getting the sort of decision makers in a room with a whiteboard and say the number to solve is 80,000. But the reality is the number to solve is larger than 80,000. It's the inflow into homelessness is pretty significant.
Yeah.
So it's looking at, I when I was working as chair of the Homeless Services Authority Commission, I went to the Red Cross because I wanted to understand if we had an earthquake that affected 50,000 people, what's the plan? Because they do those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So there are, people charged with running those scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So what if 50,000 people became homeless tomorrow? So I said, I want to see those scenarios because I want to understand what we would do, because why aren't we doing that now? And the reason we're not doing it now, that they explained to me, is there's no, they could help people on an interim basis. They have a plan for an interim, immediate sort of triage response, but they don't have a long-term response. So to answer your question, like, I think the first thing is doing both of those things at the same time. Like you have to get in and triage, which is what the mayor's been doing. That's Inside Safe. She's diving in, triage, how do we get people inside as quickly as possible?
Yep.
And then the next step, which is, part of what we're trying to solve with LA for LA, is how are we at the exact same time also either building or acquiring or converting housing that's immediately available for use on a much larger scale. And I think that, really acclimating communities with, okay, what's our part? What's our portion of this? And how are we all stepping up to contribute to some piece of this in a meaningful way? I mean, you drive around the city, I drive around the city. There are actually quite a few empty lots. We started, doing some drone footage and put some of the empty lots on our laforla.org website. There are quite a few empty lots. Maybe you're not even noticing them. You're driving by and you're not realizing there are quite a few empty lots. There are places for us to build housing, and we just got to, get to it and figure out mechanisms to do it. I mean, part of the reason I'm supporting Measure A, which will be on the ballot in the fall, is it's a combination of, for the first time, a support of services as well as housing dollars. And the fact of the matter is we need some government dollars in the game to build housing. We just do. Housing does not pencil without that right now.
Yep. So
we have to figure out, what does that look like? Maybe it's a guarantee fund. Maybe it's some piece that makes sense. And then we've got to figure out how we're incentivizing private capital. I mean, the number we need to solve for in terms of the dollar figure is billions of dollars, but it's not all on government. The point of this is if we can tap into private capital, lending institutions, CDFIs, we can tap into a huge piece of this. And then we, put some of this on government and potentially new government tools. Maybe not all the tools that we have in place are enough. Maybe we have to think about other kinds of tools.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest challenge is that, it is difficult to look at it in terms of, the big number. And I will say, I don't want to be distracted by the big number. The wins, the smaller wins, we opened up, as I said, 58, apartments last week. Those wins are really important, and they're saving people's lives. And it's really important for us to celebrate those. I don't want to diminish any one of those wins, but then we have to think about how are the wins playing into systems change that's getting us to speed and scale. That are really looking at. I don't want to see a 10-year plan, because in the course of those 10 years, that's 2,000 people each year that have died. And that's unacceptable.
Yeah. You mentioned the inflow number. What is the inflow number?
So honestly, I don't know. I mean, after the COVID relief mechanisms were lifted and the eviction protections were lifted, a ton of people were evicted, and tens of thousands evictions. And I don't know how many of those are experiencing homelessness or were able to find alternative housing. What we've definitely seen is that, and guesstimates about the inflow number, which is somewhere between around 50,000 people a year falling into homelessness. I've also seen other figures where it's closer to 80,000. I've seen as low as 30,000, because it depends how you're estimating it. But the sort of it, we do know that there are about 200,000 households that are really at serious risk of experiencing homelessness in the city of Los Angeles, based on income and and housing type. So at any given time, how it's going to strike one of those families, you don't know.
Yeah. I heard similar numbers. One time, LASA came to present to the Triple H Commission, and they only presented this chart one time. In the other subsequent times, I don't know why they I don't really understand how LASA works. That's a subject for a whole nother podcast probably. But they presented it, and their number was something like 50 or 60,000 for that year, of which they were effectively able to intervene on maybe 90% of those, and then the remaining 10% added to the count. It was basically they were showing us like a chart of how they got from.
It was 56,000.
Yeah, something like. Yeah.
And I remember that chart. And the reason they didn't continue to, I think, use that chart is it's very difficult to make these estimates. Like, it's just very difficult because you're not going to have access to perfect information.
Yeah.
But they at that time believed about 56 families had fallen into homelessness, and then through their resolution programs, they felt that they'd addressed, as you said, about 90% of it. I think it's just that's lack of great data and accurate information is one of the big challenges that face the system. And that's, and when I say the system, I just mean, at large, us, in the city and the county, trying to solve homelessness and address the housing crisis. So data being so important so that we can make great judgments about, how to spend resources and how to advocate for resources and all of those things. So it really is challenging, because when you're talking about families on the cusp of homelessness, it's not like, oh, can you please fill out this survey and then we'll enter this data into a database. It's not a reasonable request. Yeah. So it's just really difficult to get great information. One thing that's changed that's very helpful is now the tenants' rights movement and a lot of the legal aid organizations that are working with tenants have created better systems in terms of access to data around evictions and being able to identify folks who are facing an eviction and being able to make contact. And so, because if you can get to somebody before they're actually evicted, and try to make sure you're accessing resources at that time. So that's something where I think we can, particularly working with the court system, can do a better job of making sure people have access to that kind of to whatever resources they're eligible for. But we have a fundamental problem in Los Angeles. It's different than other states where, 1 in 8 families that are eligible for federal subsidies for rent get them. So that's not true in a lot of East Coast cities. So when somebody's looking for why in Los Angeles, why are we struggling in Los Angeles? Well, a lot of federal policy hasn't supported increased resources to Los Angeles and other regions because they sort of are heavily weighted towards, well, the age of a building. Well, our buildings are not as old as buildings on the East Coast. They're just not. We were settled later.
Yeah.
Our buildings were made later. So age of a building sort of affects your overall resource profile, what federal resources you're going to get for rent subsidy. And that changes the amount of subsidy, a place like Los Angeles gets. So we don't have, every family who's eligible for federal support for rent, they don't get it. They sit on a long wait list. And something that, the mayor has done is really effectively advocate for Los Angeles and say, this is what we need. So back to that big room with a whiteboard is, well, at a minimum, all of our families that are eligible for federal support should get it. And so that's one thing. The other thing is the documentation requirements. They're onerous for somebody who is housed. I don't know if you've ever lost a passport or a driver's license. It is not fun. If you can imagine being unhoused, trying to figure out that documentation. So another piece of this is the mayor was able to win what's called presumptive eligibility. So get people into housing and then figure that out. Like within a reasonable time, within 120 days or 90 days, you have to have resolved these issues. But stop waiting for, as she phrases it, somebody in a tent who has to prove that they're poor. How do you prove a negative?
Yeah.
You don't have any paper that says,
Totally.
you have selfies in the tent. I mean, that's not going to work.
Yeah, it's pretty basic. I'm glad that she won that because that's a fight to absolutely had to win. It makes absolutely no sense that paperwork people.
Yeah. But I'm not sure. And this is kind of goes back to the original part of our conversation around a civic culture. I think all of our civic leaders need to know our families don't get all the resources they are eligible for. They deserve this federal support for rent subsidies, and we don't get them. And if we had them, more people could build housing because they would use them to finance housing. If we had them, more people would be housed. So part of, this explosion of people experiencing homelessness, it really has to do with a broken system kind of at every level.
Totally. If you could solve, let's just say in this thought experiment, let's say that the $50 to $90 billion of money that McKinsey estimated was necessary to build our way out of this housing crisis, let's say that manifested somehow. Are there other things that would have to change? Because we talked a lot about these other issues inside of this system, like mental health and substance abuse. Are there big legal changes that are required in those areas, or is it more a matter of just adequately funding those resources as well as this housing resource?
I think that I think if we had the housing resources in place as well as I said, like the frontline workers in place, I think that would go a long way. In terms of legal changes, there's already been some changes over the last 2 years to what's called grave disability, as well as the implementation of care courts. So I'm not positive that we need more legal changes at this point, but there is something called a Medicare waiver, which would increase access to acute care. They're in Medicare back, as you were describing, so in 1965, the Medicare Act actually to prevent what you were describing, which were these large scale institutions that were really not doing anyone any good.
Yeah.
They limited the number of beds in an acute care unit to 16 beds.
Okay.
So changing that and connecting those beds to the right sort of supports would be very helpful. As a builder, like if you have a cap like that, well, then nobody's going to build those. And so what happened over time is a lot of private hospitals closed because they couldn't get Medicare reimbursement at the levels that they needed it, except for 16 of the units. So that's been challenging. And if you have a child who's suffering a mental health crisis, you can go to a wait room where they do have mental health beds, and you can wait in that waiting room for days for one of those beds to open up. I mean, I've talked to parents who have been sitting in a waiting room for 3-4 days waiting for a bed to open with a child that they think cannot be unsupervised, is in a severe crisis at that moment. So, and that is because of that law. So I would say there's that one law fix would help a lot, but the overall access to care, access to housing, that piece, that is where we have to focus our time and energy, because you can have somebody have a great outcome at care court, and they're basically going to be written a prescription by the court. Like, you need housing, you need access to care. Well, if they leave that courthouse and they have none, we haven't done any good. So we have to figure out how we're supporting that with the right housing and the right care.
Yeah. Which is why I think Measure A, as you mentioned, is a great first step. And I feel like the state and probably the federal government, they need to go and add on to that.
Yeah, for sure.
Right?
For sure. Yeah.
Because the amount of resources needed. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is we've spent a lot of time in this town over the last decade, let's say, talking about housing. And there's been some great wins, like Triple H was a good win. And Measure A will probably be another win. And
Hopefully.
Right? Yeah, fingers crossed. But people aren't really talking that much, at least in the press and in sort of the narrative, about the access to care. And I feel like the access to care it may be a more effective intervention only because it's so hard to do things in this town. The solving sort of the political challenges of building and stuff is man, that seems really daunting. But the idea of let's beef up our mental health workforce and provide funds, it feels like you could make that a win relatively quickly.
No question.
Yeah.
But I think, and as we've been talking about, what is the real speed and scale? We have to do both. But there's no question that we could, that access to care is a really important piece of this. And, if you get involved, you meet just these absolutely wonderful people who are dedicating their lives to it. And we just need more of them. We need them empowered. We need them, supported on the front line. So I think care is a big piece of it. But I really believe in us. I think we can build housing at the same time. I mean, I think that we can sort of change the culture here. And why not? And put a ton of people to work building housing. How great is that? I mean, so I think there are some huge wins that we can tackle if we could do both at the same time. And I just don't see why not.
Yeah, I totally agree with the sentiment. The building is a win-win. There's a massive coalition. What Angeleno doesn't want to have cheaper housing?
Yeah.
Nobody, basically.
Right.
Yeah, so I feel like there is a massive coalition potential. It's the trades. It's even if you want job growth in this town, that's a great way to get some job growth.
Yeah. And why not why not have families? I mean, as your children get older, you're going to be I really want them to stay near me. And the opportunities for them to stay here become more and more limited. Yeah. So we just have to change that mindset. I mean, if you look at the billions of dollars that we need, part of it is just changing. People don't need to make a 20% return on real estate, which is not an unheard of return. It's not unheard of. 15% is not an unheard of return. That's too much. We don't need to have those kinds of rates of return on things like affordable housing. On affordable housing, why isn't that treated almost like treasury rates? And it, a 5% return is great. It's awesome. And then maybe we can get pension funds that can invest in that. And maybe we could have, the credits that banks get, the CRA credits, what they're investing in it. And so I think it's daunting when you look at these numbers, unless you sort of push back and say, oh, wait, there is some creativity in this space that we could be pushing on, that could really change how we approach it. And we don't, people don't need to flip property over and over again, and making money every step of the way. It's like, well, maybe we can figure out a better way that people make long-term sustained returns, but particularly on affordable housing, where it doesn't have to be that, somebody is making, 15% off of it.
That's right. Well, Sarah, thanks for taking so much of your time.
No problem.
We went way past the initial, but I really
You're going to have to edit this down.
Yeah. Appreciate all these ideas, and I appreciate you and the work that you do. You're such a passionate advocate for this city and for the state and for the country, and appreciate you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Happy to do it.